It started on an ordinary Tuesday. My best friend Ethan hadn't shown up to school, and no one seemed to know where he was. I texted him a few times, but there was no reply. By the end of the day, worry began to creep in. Ethan was never the kind of person to just vanish. That evening, I decided to stop by his house. His mom answered the door, her eyes red and swollen. She didn't say much, just shook her head and mumbled, "He didn't come home last night." The police were already involved, but something about the way she looked at me made my skin crawl. It was like she knew something she wasn't saying. The next day, rumors spread through school. Some said Ethan ran away. Others claimed he was kidnapped. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The last time I'd seen him was Monday evening. We were walking home together, laughing about some dumb joke. He'd taken his usual shortcut through the woods near his house. I'd offered to walk with him, but he waved me off, saying he'd be fine. I couldn't stop thinking about those woods. Everyone avoided them. They were dense, dark, and strangely quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. That night, against my better judgment, I decided to go back. I told myself it was to look for clues, but deep down, I knew I needed answers. The moon was bright, casting an eerie glow through the trees. The further I went, the colder it got, even though it was the middle of summer. My flashlight flickered and I cursed under my breath. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. Then I saw it. A single shoe, half buried in the dirt. It was Ethan's. My heart raced as I picked it up, the fabric damp and cold. I called out his name, my voice echoing through the trees. There was no answer, just the suffocating silence. I turned to leave, but the path was gone. The trees seemed closer, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. My flashlight flickered again, and in that brief moment of light, I saw something in the distance. A figure, barely visible through the shadows. "Ethan?" I called, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I took a cautious step forward, but the moment I did, the figure darted behind a tree, impossibly fast. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt frozen. Then I heard it. A low whisper, so faint I almost didn't catch it. "Help me." It was Ethan's voice, but it sounded wrong, distorted like it was coming from underwater. I ran toward the sound, tripping over roots and rocks until I reached a small clearing. There, in the center, was a circle of stones, scorched black. The ground around it was littered with more of Ethan's things, his backpack, his watch, even his phone, screen cracked and dark. But there was no sign of him. I screamed his name again, but this time the whisper came from right behind me. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the trees looming and silent. My flashlight went out completely, plunging me into darkness. I don't remember how I got out of those woods. I woke up hours later on the side of the road, clutching Ethan's shoe. He was never found. They say he must have run away, but I know the truth. Something in those woods took him, and whatever it was, it wanted me to follow. When we moved into the old house, I thought it was the start of something new and exciting. The place was big and full of charm, with creaky floors and high ceilings. It felt like a fresh beginning for my mom and me. But it didn't take long for strange things to start happening. At first, it was little noises, soft thuds and creaks that I thought were just the house settling. "Old houses make sounds," Mom said with a shrug, but the noises didn't feel random. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving inside the walls. One night I woke up to a faint tapping. It came from the wall behind my bed. I stared at the spot, frozen, listening as the tapping turned into scratching. My heart raced and I whispered, "Mom," but she didn't answer. The noise stopped suddenly, leaving an eerie silence. The next morning I told her about it. She laughed it off and said it was probably mice. "We'll call someone to check it out," she promised. But the sounds didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. I started hearing whispers. At first I thought it was my imagination, but the more I listened, the clearer they became. Faint, raspy words I couldn't quite understand. One night I pressed my ear to the wall, and my blood ran cold. I heard breathing. Slow, heavy breathing, like someone was just on the other side. I couldn't sleep after that. I started leaving my bedroom light on, hoping it would make me feel safer, but it didn't help. The air in the house always felt heavy, like someone was watching. I started noticing little things too. Objects moved when no one touched them. My toothbrush would be on the counter when I was sure I'd left it in the holder. The TV remote would disappear and turn up in another room. Mom insisted I was being careless, but I knew I wasn't. One night, I woke up to the sound of something dragging along the floor. My heart pounded as I sat up in bed. The sound was coming from the hallway, just outside my door. Slowly, the doorknob turned, and the door creaked open a few inches. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the dark gap, too scared to move. And then I saw it. A hand, a thin, pale hand with long, bony fingers, reached through the crack. It was covered in dirt, the nails cracked and jagged. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even breathe. The hand retreated, and I heard soft footsteps moving back down the hall. The next day, I begged Mom to leave the house, but she wouldn't listen. She said I was imagining things, that I was letting my fear get the better of me. I couldn't tell her what I saw. I didn't want her to think I was crazy. A week later, a repairman came to check the walls for the supposed mice. He didn't find any rodents, but he found something else. A small crawl space hidden behind a loose panel. Inside, there was a filthy sleeping bag, empty food wrappers, and a notebook filled with pages of strange, scrawled writing. That was when Mom finally believed me. We left the house that night, and I never looked back. But sometimes in the middle of the night, I wake up to the memory of that hand reaching through the door, and I wonder if he's still there, waiting for the next family to move in. When we moved into the house, the basement was the one place I didn't like. The rest of the house felt warm and inviting, but the basement was different. It smelled damp, like old wood and mold, and the air down there was always thick and cold, even on hot summer days. The single light bulb hanging from the ceiling barely lit the space, leaving dark corners that seemed to stretch endlessly. I wasn't supposed to go down there. My mom said it was unsafe, rickety stairs, exposed wires, but something about her tone made me think there was another reason. She avoided the basement completely, never even opening the door. My dad didn't seem to notice anything strange, though he rarely went down there either. One day, curiosity got the better of me. I waited until my parents were out and crept down the creaky stairs, flashlight in hand. As I reached the bottom, the light from the bulb flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. The basement was mostly empty except for some old furniture and boxes piled in the corners. But the feeling in the air was heavy, like I wasn't alone. As I walked further in, my flashlight flickered. I stopped, shining it around the room. That's when I saw them. Handprints, small and smudged, on the dusty floor near the far wall. They looked like they belonged to a child. My chest tightened. I hadn't touched anything down here, and no one else had been in the basement. I knelt to get a closer look, and that's when I felt it. A faint, cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. There was nothing there, just the stairs and the door at the top slightly ajar. I told myself it was just my imagination and hurried back upstairs, slamming the door behind me. But the feeling of being watched stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind. That night, I woke up to a noise. Faint, but distinct. It sounded like something tapping, a slow, deliberate rhythm. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, but then I realized it was coming from below, from the basement. I got out of bed, my heart pounding. I didn't want to go down there, but I couldn't ignore the sound. I crept down the hallway and stopped at the basement door. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a soft, rhythmic creak, like footsteps on the stairs. Holding my breath, I opened the door just enough to peek inside. The light in the basement was off, but something moved in the darkness, a shadow shifting at the bottom of the stairs. My flashlight was in the kitchen, too far to grab, so I stood frozen, unable to look away. Then I heard it. A whisper, soft and high-pitched, like a child's voice. "You shouldn't have come down here." I slammed the door and locked it, my hands shaking. The creaking stopped, replaced by silence. But as I backed away, I heard the faintest sound, something scratching against the other side of the door, slow and deliberate. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, My mom found me sitting by the door, pale and shaking. She didn't ask what happened. She just said, "I told you to stay away." We moved out a month later. No one ever explained why, but I never went near a basement again. Sometimes, though, I wake up at night and hear tapping, faint and distant, as if it's still following me. My little brother Liam started talking to the shadows when he was 4. At first, I thought it was just his imagination. Kids do that, right? They play pretend, talk to things that aren't there. But as time went on, it wasn't just pretend anymore. It started one evening when we were playing in the living room. Liam was sitting by the window, staring at the corner of the room where the shadows seemed to stretch longer than normal. I was watching TV, trying to ignore the soft hum of the house. That's when I heard him. "Hello," he said, his voice high and innocent. I glanced over at him, but he wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the corner of the room. I shrugged it off, thinking he was just talking to himself. Then he said, "You're not scary. My sister doesn't like you, but I'm not scared." I froze. I had been in the kitchen a moment ago, and I knew no one else was there. I asked him who he was talking to, but he just smiled. That innocent little smile that children do when they're being sweet. "Just the shadows," he said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. I tried to laugh it off, but something felt off. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing soft whispering from his room. It was quiet at first, like a gentle rustle, but then it grew louder. It sounded like Liam was talking again, but I couldn't make out the words. I quietly walked down the hall and peeked into his room. There he was, standing in front of his closet, talking to the darkness. I couldn't see anything in the shadows, but I could hear him speaking in a language that wasn't his. The words were soft, like a murmur, but the tone was cold. I called out to him, and he immediately stopped. He turned to me with wide, innocent eyes and said, "It's okay, sis. They like me." I didn't know what to say. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. It wasn't just the shadows anymore. It was the way Liam looked at them, like they were his friends. The next night, things got worse. I was half asleep when I heard Liam's voice again. I quickly got up, feeling a knot in my stomach. This time, the shadows in his room seemed darker, moving, as if they were alive. I felt a cold chill run through me as I stood in the doorway, watching my little brother, his back turned to me. "Why do you always leave?" Liam asked softly. "They want to play." Suddenly his voice changed. It wasn't the sweet voice of my little brother anymore. It was deep, guttural, something older, something that wasn't human. "Come closer," the voice whispered, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the corner of the room. My heart raced, and I backed away, my body frozen with fear. The shadows seemed to shift, like they were reaching out toward me. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to my parents' room, shaking, and told them everything. When they checked on Liam, he was asleep in his bed, breathing softly. But the corner of his room, where the shadows had been, was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. The next day, Liam was quiet, not his usual talkative self. He wouldn't look at the corner of the room. When I asked him why, he just whispered, "They're gone. For now." But I knew. I knew the shadows were still there, waiting. And my little brother? He wasn't talking to them anymore. They were talking to him. It was late and the road was long. I had been driving for hours, the night stretching out in front of me, only the occasional passing car and the hum of the engine keeping me company. My eyes were heavy with tiredness, but I had to keep going. There was no other way to get home. I was in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where the trees seem to stretch on forever, and the darkness feels alive. As I rounded a bend in the road, I saw a figure standing on the side. A woman, her thumb outstretched, asking for a ride. It wasn't unusual to see hitchhikers out here. This stretch of highway was known for them. But something about her made me pause. She was wearing an old, tattered coat, despite the warmth of the night, and her hair hung limp, partially covering her face. Her eyes, though, were what made me slow down. There was something familiar about them. I rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" I asked, trying not to sound too uneasy. She nodded slowly and climbed into the passenger seat without a word. The smell of damp earth and something faintly metallic filled the car as she settled in. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the silence, but she didn't answer. I glanced at her briefly, and I could see her hands shaking. "Are you okay?" I asked again, a little more insistently. Her eyes met mine then, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. It was like I was staring into a mirror. Those eyes, that same hollow stare, a look that echoed with memories I couldn't place. My heart raced, and I suddenly felt like I was suffocating. "I know what you did," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I froze, my blood running cold. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I had never seen this woman before. What did she mean by that? What? I stammered, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. Her lips curled into a small, unsettling smile. "I know everything about you. You think you can run, but you can't escape." I turned to look at her again, but she was no longer smiling. Her face was pale, almost translucent, like a ghost. My breath caught in my throat. Her skin looked unnatural, and as she leaned closer, I could see that her eyes were no longer human. They were black, empty holes staring back at me. "Stop the car," she demanded, her voice cold and sharp. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. She opened the door and stepped out, her footsteps eerily silent. I watched, unable to move, as she turned and walked into the woods at the side of the road. But as soon as I tried to drive away, a sudden wave of nausea hit me. My vision blurred. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't breathe. I looked down at the passenger seat. Empty. She was gone. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. But when I stepped out of the car, my legs buckled beneath me. I could feel something heavy in the air, like a weight on my chest. I stumbled toward a gas station, desperate for any sign of normalcy. But when I looked into the reflection in the glass door, my heart stopped. There, staring back at me, was the same woman, her hollow eyes, that same unsettling smile. "You can't run," she whispered again. But I wasn't sure if it was in my head or if it was her voice, still following me, still waiting. The day of my grandmother's funeral was cold and gray, the kind of day where the clouds hang low, heavy with rain that never quite falls. The house felt too quiet after everyone left, just me and my parents, sitting in the living room, exhausted and drained from all the funeral arrangements. I don't remember much of the afternoon, just the sadness that weighed down the air, making everything feel wrong. After dinner, I went upstairs to my room, hoping the silence would help me forget, even for a moment. As soon as I sat down on my bed, I heard it, the phone ringing downstairs. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, maybe a trick of the wind. But the ringing continued, sharp and insistent. It was the house phone, the one that never rang unless someone was calling. But who would be calling? We hadn't received any calls all day, especially not after everything that happened. My heart began to race, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I hesitated for a moment, then stood up. My feet moved almost on their own as I walked down the hallway and downstairs. The phone was still ringing when I reached the kitchen. I picked it up slowly, my hand shaking as I pressed the receiver to my ear. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause, a silence so deep I thought maybe it was just a wrong number. But then, the voice came through, soft, shaky, but unmistakably familiar. "Grandma?" I gasped, my heart stopping in my chest. The voice on the other end of the line sounded just like her, gentle, familiar, as if she were standing right there in the room with me. "I'm okay, sweetheart," she said, her words soft and calming, like she used to speak when I was younger. But something was wrong. The words didn't sound quite right. There was an edge to them, something unnatural. "Grandma?" I repeated, my voice cracking. How are you calling me?" There was a pause. Then the voice responded, this time colder, almost distant. "I'm here. I'm still here with you." My blood turned cold. I felt my legs go weak, and I stumbled back, almost dropping the phone. I wanted to hang up, but I couldn't move. The air in the room felt thicker, heavier, and I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, the voice began to whisper something. It was hard to understand, too quiet at first. but as it grew louder, I could make out the words, "I'm not in the ground. I'm still watching you." My skin crawled. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I just stood there, frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from the phone in my hand. Suddenly, the line went dead. The silence that followed was suffocating. I dropped the phone and ran up to my parents, my heart racing, my breath coming in short gasps. When I told them, they just stared at me as if I had lost my mind. There was no explanation. The phone was dead, no one had called, and no one had been on the other end. The next day, when we went to the cemetery to visit my grandmother's grave, I noticed something strange. Her gravestone, which had been perfectly smooth and clean, had a single crack running down the center, almost like a line had been drawn across it. And as I stood there, I could have sworn I heard a voice just faintly, whispering my name. I'm still here. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when my friends and I decided to hike through the woods behind my house. We had done it 100 times before, but today felt different. The air was heavy, and the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves seemed muffled, like the forest was holding its breath. We walked deeper into the trees, laughing and joking, but something was off. It felt like we were being watched. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the wind, but I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like someone, or something, was there. After about an hour of walking, we came to a clearing. There, in the middle, stood a tall, twisted tree with branches that seemed to reach out like fingers. We sat down, tired, and began chatting, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I glanced around the clearing, but there was no one. I shook it off again, trying to enjoy the moment, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. That's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, standing just at the edge of the trees, was a figure. It was tall and thin, wearing a dark cloak that seemed to blend with the shadows. At first, I thought it was one of my friends playing a joke, but then I realized something terrifying. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there staring at us. I nudged my friend Jessica, who was sitting next to me. "Do you see that?" I whispered. She looked over, her eyes wide with confusion. "I don't see anything," she said. But when I pointed to the figure, she gasped. "What is that?" We all turned to look, and the figure was still there, unmoving, just watching. My heart pounded in my chest. I stood up, my legs shaking. "We need to go. Now." But as we turned to leave, the figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It was like the trees parted just for it. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I could feel my skin crawl. "We're being followed," I said, panic rising in my voice. My friends didn't need to be told twice. We all started running, but no matter how fast we went, I could still feel it behind us, following just out of sight but always there. We stumbled and tripped over branches and rocks, and the air grew colder with every step. I didn't dare look behind me. I just ran, my breath coming in gasps. The forest seemed to close in around us, and the trees loomed like dark giants, blocking out the sun. Finally, after what felt like forever, we reached the edge of the woods. The figure was gone, but the dread didn't leave. We didn't stop running until we were back at my house, out of breath and trembling. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Every creak of the house, every rustle outside made my heart race. I kept the blinds closed tight, but I swear, if I looked closely enough, I could see a shadow moving just beyond the trees. I haven't been back in those woods since. Every time I look out my window, I wonder if the figure is still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows again. It was supposed to be a fresh start. My wife Claire and I had just bought an old farmhouse in the countryside. It was the perfect place to get away from the hustle and bustle, to live quietly. The house was big, with creaky floors and old wooden beams, but I thought it had charm. The first night we stayed there, everything seemed fine. We unpacked, made dinner, and sat by the fire. But as the night went on, I started to notice things. The house felt heavy. The air was thick, like something was pressing down on us. I didn't say anything to Claire, but I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. The next day, we started exploring. The house had been empty for years, and it showed. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. But there was something strange about the second floor. A door at the end of the hall was locked. I asked the realtor about it, but she just shrugged. "It's probably just a storage room," she said. But something in her eyes made me think she was hiding something. That night, after Claire fell asleep, I heard it. A soft sound, like a tapping. I got out of bed, thinking it was a pipe or something settling in the walls. But the sound was coming from behind the locked door. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed a screwdriver from the toolbox, and with a few twists, the door creaked open. The room was small, barely furnished, but what caught my eye was the mirror. It was old, framed with ornate gold, but the glass was cracked. What was unsettling wasn't just the cracked glass. It was the reflection. I could see myself, but there was something else in the mirror standing behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. I shut the door quickly, my hands shaking. Claire woke up as I got back into bed. She asked what I was doing, but I didn't tell her. I didn't want to scare her. The next morning, things only got worse. I started seeing figures out of the corner of my eye, shadows moving in the hallway, strange shapes that disappeared when I turned to look. And Claire, she wasn't herself. She'd started talking to herself, whispering things I couldn't hear. I tried to confront her about it, but she just stared at me, like she didn't know what I was talking about. That night, we both heard it. A voice coming from the walls. "Leave," it whispered over and over again. I jumped out of bed trying to find the source, but the voice seemed to be coming from everywhere. The house was alive. It was breathing. We packed our bags, but when we tried to leave, the door wouldn't open. No matter how hard we pulled, the door was stuck. I banged on the windows, screamed for help, but no one came. The house wouldn't let us leave. The air grew colder, the shadows darker. The voice in the walls grew louder. "Stay, stay forever." The house wasn't just a house. It was something else, something old, something that had been waiting for us. We were trapped, stuck in a nightmare we couldn't escape. And now, every night, I hear the voice telling me to stay. I don't know how much longer I can fight it. It was a quiet evening when I got home from work. The house was always still, too still, but I had grown used to the silence. I lived alone, so there wasn't anyone to share the noise of the day with. The only sound I ever really heard was the occasional creak of the floorboards as I walked through the house. That night, as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, something felt off. The air was colder than usual, and I could smell something faintly metallic, like iron. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my tired mind playing tricks. But then I saw it. There was something on the hallway floor. It was a dark, sticky stain. At first, I thought it was just a spilled drink or something from the ceiling. But as I stepped closer, I realized what it was. It was blood. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, staring at the stain. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a small amount. It spread across the floor in a wide, dark pool, and it led down the hall toward my bedroom. I don't know why I followed it. Maybe I thought I'd imagined it. Maybe I thought someone else had been in the house. But my feet moved before I could stop them. The blood trail led straight to my bedroom door. My hand shook as I reached for the handle. It was cold, too cold, and when I opened it, I saw what I feared. There, in the middle of the room, was a message, written in the blood that had spilled across the floor. It was crude, the letters jagged and uneven, but unmistakable. "Leave now." I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the words. My mind raced. Who could have done this? How did they get in? And why leave a message? Then I heard it, a noise from behind me. It was a soft shuffle, like someone moving across the floor. I spun around, but there was no one there. My chest tightened. I was alone. I knew I was alone. I backed away from the message, my heart pounding. The room felt colder now, colder than ever before. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Something was wrong, something I couldn't understand. Then, as I turned to run, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of the room. A shadow. It was fleeting, but it was there. A figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond the edge of the door frame. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't wait to look again. I ran out of the room, out of the house, and into the night. The chill followed me, gnawing at my skin, my bones. I never went back to that house. No one ever found any trace of the blood, the message, or the figure that had been standing in my room. But I know what I saw. To this day, I can still smell the metallic scent of the blood, and sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see the shadow in the corner. It's watching me. It's waiting. And every night, I can hear its soft shuffle, closer and closer. I first heard the voice when I was 8 years old. It was soft, almost a whisper, and it came from the dark corner of my room one night as I lay in bed. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but as the voice called my name again, clearer this time, I froze. Sophie. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice didn't sound like anyone I knew. It was soft but cold, like it had traveled a long way to find me. I turned on my bedside lamp, but the room was empty. I checked every corner, every shadow, and found nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. Over the years, the voice didn't go away. It followed me from room to room, from house to house, always whispering my name when I was alone. I tried to ignore it, but it grew louder each time. Sophie, Sophie, the whispers echoed in the silence of the night. Sometimes it would speak when I was at school, or when I was walking home, too close, too real. No one else seemed to hear it. As I grew older, the voice became more persistent. It would whisper to me during the day, calling my name like it wanted something. Sophie, I'm waiting. I would look around, but there was no one there. The strange part was the voice didn't just speak. It mimicked my own thoughts, like it knew what I was thinking before I even said it. It was like it was always inside my head. The worst part came when I was 14. One night, the voice didn't whisper. It screamed, "Sophie, help me, please!" I jumped out of bed, my heart racing. The voice sounded so real, so desperate that I ran to my parents' room, shaking. But when I told them, they just looked at me like I was crazy. I knew something wasn't right. The voice had never been this loud or this desperate before. It was as if something had changed. I started to hear it more often, even in crowded places like at the grocery store or on the bus. It was always calling me, always just behind me, never letting me go. And always it sounded like it was getting closer. One evening, I was alone at home, sitting on the couch watching TV, when the voice spoke again. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was right behind me. "Sophie, I'm in the house." I froze, the blood draining from my face. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The house was silent except for the beating of my heart. I slowly turned around, my body trembling. There, in the hallway, stood a figure. It was shadowy, indistinct, but I could feel its eyes on me. The voice, now in a harsh, gravelly tone, said, "I've been waiting for you." I screamed and ran out of the house, not caring where I went, just needing to get away. But even now, the voice follows me. It calls my name when the room is silent. It waits in the dark. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear it, right next to me, whispering, "Sophie, I'm still here."